Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, quick intro. We're covering the complete World Cup history of all 48 teams competing in 2026 before the tournament starts. Every nation's story, the glory, the heartbreak, the drama. All I ask, subscribe, hit the bell, leave a like. That's it. Now let's dive in. Uruguay, 3.5 million people. That's it. Smaller than the city of Los Angeles. Fewer people than the population of Connecticut. And yet, 2 World Cup stars on their jersey. 2 World Cups won. The same number as Argentina and France, nations with 10 times Uruguay's population. This tiny country that you could drive across in 3 hours has dominated world football in ways that seem impossible. This is the story of how Uruguay became the first World Cup champions in 1930, pulled off the greatest upset in football history in 1950, declined into decades of mediocrity and missed tournaments, then came roaring back in the 2000s as the giant killers nobody wanted to face. From absolute dominance to forgotten obscurity to modern warriors. This is Uruguay. Before the World Cup even existed, Uruguay were already the best team on the planet. We need to start in the 1920s to understand just how dominant they were. Back then, the Olympic football tournament was the closest thing to a World Cup. There was no FIFA World Cup yet, so the Olympics were where the best national teams competed. Paris 1924 Olympics. European teams had never seen football like this. Uruguay arrived in France and played a style of football that was 20 years ahead of its time. Technical, fluid, devastating. Beautiful passing combinations. They weren't just winning, they were putting on a show. Beat Yugoslavia 7-0 in the final. 7. NEL. Gold medal. Europe was completely shocked. Who were these South Americans playing football from the future? The Uruguayan style became the talk of world football. 4 years later, Amsterdam, 1928 Olympics. Uruguay came back to defend their title, and they did it again. Beat Argentina 2-1 in a replay final after drawing 1-1 in the first match. Back-to-back Olympic champions. Undisputed, unquestionable best team in the world. By 1928, when people talked about football excellence, they talked about Uruguay. So when FIFA decided in 1929 to create a World Cup tournament, the question wasn't whether Uruguay would be favourites. The question was whether anyone else even had a chance. And FIFA made a decision that seemed obvious. The first World Cup would be hosted in Montevideo, Uruguay. It was 1930, exactly 100 years since Uruguay's independence. What better way to celebrate than hosting the world's first football championship? But here's where it gets complicated. Most European teams refused to come. The journey from Europe to Uruguay in 1930 took weeks on a boat across the Atlantic. It was expensive, it was long, and many European federations thought it wasn't worth it. Only 4 European teams made the trip: France, Belgium, Romania, and Yugoslavia. That's it. The rest of Europe stayed home. So the first World Cup was dominated by South American teams, with a few Europeans mixed in. Uruguay didn't care about the European boycott. They had a tournament to win on home soil. They were defending their status as the best team on the planet, and they were going to prove it. The Estadio Centenario was built specifically for this World Cup. A beautiful stadium that still stands today, holding 90,000 people. Group stage? Uruguay didn't just win, they dominated. Destroyed Peru 1-0 in a tight defensive match, then absolutely demolished Romania 4-0. Pedro Chea scoring a hat-trick. Uruguay topped their group easily and advanced to the semi-finals along with Argentina, Yugoslavia, and the United States, who had surprisingly made it through as well. The semi-final draw put Uruguay against Yugoslavia, one of the 4 European teams that had actually made the journey, and Uruguay showed no mercy. 6-1. Absolutely destroyed them. Pedro Chea scored twice, Anselmo scored twice, Iriarte scored, Gestido scored. Complete domination. Uruguay were heading to the final of the first ever World Cup. And who were they facing? Argentina, their neighbours across the Rio de la Plata, their biggest rivals. This wasn't just a football match, this was national pride on the line. 93,000 people packed into Estadio Centenario, the biggest crowd most players had ever seen. the first ever World Cup final. Uruguay versus Argentina. Everything, absolutely everything, was on the line. The match started cautiously. Both teams nervous, both teams knowing what this meant. Then Argentina struck first. Pablo Dorado scored for Uruguay, but Argentina came back with 2 goals before halftime. Pucel and Stabile. At halftime, Argentina were winning 2-1. Uruguay were losing. At home, in the World Cup final, in front of their own people. 93,000 Uruguayans watching their team trail. The pressure was absolutely crushing. But something happened in that Uruguayan dressing room at halftime. Whatever coach Alberto Supici said, whatever fire he lit, it worked. Uruguay came out for the second half like a different team. 57th minute, Pedro Chea equalised. 2-2. The stadium erupted. Then 68th minute, Santos Iriarte. 3-2 Uruguay. The comeback was complete. But it wasn't over yet. 89th minute, Hector Castro, the one-armed striker who'd lost his arm in an accident as a child, scored the 4th. 4-2. The final whistle blew. Uruguay were the first ever World Cup champions. The entire nation went absolutely insane. People flooded the streets. Ships in Montevideo harbour blasted their horns for hours. The next day was declared a national holiday. Uruguay, this tiny nation of barely 1.5 million people in 1930, had beaten their biggest rival at home to become the first World Cup winners in history. They'd already won 2 Olympic golds, and now this. They were the undisputed kings of world football. Nobody, absolutely nobody, could touch them. But then something strange and petty happened. Uruguay didn't defend their title. FIFA awarded the 1934 World Cup to Italy and the 1938 World Cup to France, and Uruguay boycotted both tournaments. They refused to go. Why? Because they felt disrespected. In 1930, most of Europe had refused to make the journey to Uruguay for their World Cup. So Uruguay's football federation essentially said, fine, you didn't come to our World Cup, we're not coming to yours. Petty? Absolutely, but also kind of understandable from their perspective. They'd hosted, they'd won, and Europe had mostly ignored it. So Uruguay ignored Europe's World Cups. This meant that for 20 years, from 1930 to 1950, Uruguay didn't compete in a World Cup. The 1942 and 1946 tournaments were cancelled because of World War II, so those don't count. But Uruguay deliberately skipped 1934 and 1938. The reigning champions just didn't show up. By 1950, enough time had passed. Uruguay agreed to return to the World Cup, which was being held in Brazil, 20 years since they'd won it. A whole new generation of players. Could they possibly recapture the magic of 1930? The 1950 World Cup had a strange format that they never used again. Instead of knockout rounds after the groups, there was a final group stage. The 4 group winners advanced to a final round-robin group of 4 teams: Brazil, Uruguay, Spain and Sweden. They'd each play each other once, and whoever had the most points at the end would be World Cup champions. No final match, just a final group. Uruguay started slowly, drew 2-2 with Spain. That wasn't great, then beat Sweden 3-2. Better but still shaky. Meanwhile, Brazil were destroying everyone. 7-1 against Sweden, 6-1 against Spain. Brazil weren't just winning, they were demolishing teams. They looked unstoppable. Going into the final match day, the standings were Brazil with 4 points, Uruguay with 3 points. Brazil just needed a draw against Uruguay to win the World Cup. A single point. At Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro, in front of their home fans. Brazil were massive favourites. This was supposed to be a formality. The Brazilian newspaper headlines were already printed for the next day. Brazil world champions, they read. The mayor of Rio had even prepared a victory speech. 200,000 people packed into Maracanã. Still the World Cup attendance record to this day. The biggest crowd in football history. They weren't there to watch a match. They were there to watch Brazil become world champions. The trophy was practically already theirs. Uruguay? They were just the necessary opponent to make it official. The match kicked off. Brazil attacked. Uruguay defended deep, compact, organised. This was going to be tough, but Brazil had the quality. They just needed patience. Then, 47 minutes in, Friata scored for Brazil. 1-0, Maracanã absolutely erupted. The noise was deafening. Fireworks were going off outside the stadium. Brazil were 43 minutes from winning the World Cup at home. Parties were starting in the streets of Rio. This was happening. But Uruguay, tiny Uruguay with their warrior mentality, their garra charrua as they call it, they didn't panic. They kept their shape, kept defending, kept looking for their moment. And in the 66th minute, they found it. Juan Alberto Schiaffino, running onto a pass from Giglia, slotted the ball past the Brazilian goalkeeper. 1-1. Suddenly Maracanã went quiet. 200,000 people in complete stunned silence. Brazil still just needed a draw. 1-1 was fine, but the confidence was shaken. The inevitability was gone, and Uruguay could sense it. They could feel Brazil's nerves. 79th minute. Alcides Giglia received the ball on the right wing. He drove into the box. The Brazilian defender expected a cross. But Giglia didn't cross, he shot. Near post. The goalkeeper Barbosa was caught off guard. The ball went in. 2-1 Uruguay. The biggest stadium in the world went silent. You could hear individual voices in a crowd of 200,000 people. Complete, utter shock. Brazil pushed desperately for the equaliser. They had 11 minutes. Surely they could find one goal at home in front of 200,000 fans. They threw everything forward. But Uruguay's defence held. Every ball cleared, every shot blocked, every attack snuffed out. The final whistle blew. Uruguay 2, Brazil 1. For a moment there was just silence. Then the Uruguayan players exploded in celebration, while 200,000 Brazilians sat in stunned, devastated silence. Uruguay were world champions again. In Brazil, at Maracanã, silencing the biggest crowd in football history. This moment, this match, is called the Maracanazo, the Maracanã blow. It's considered the greatest upset in football history. Brazil was so traumatised by this defeat that they never wore white jerseys again. They switched to the famous yellow and blue because white reminded them of this disaster. Brazilian goalkeeper Barbosa was blamed for the rest of his life. He once said that the maximum sentence for murder in Brazil was 30 years, but he'd been paying for his mistake for longer than that. The trauma was that deep. Uruguay had done the impossible. 2 World Cups, 2 titles. One in 1930 at home against Argentina, one in 1950 in Brazil, at Maracanã, in front of 200,000 hostile fans. Uruguay, this nation of barely 2 million people by 1950, had proven they were giants. Absolute giants of world football. But here's the thing about reaching the absolute peak. There's only one direction to go from there. And for Uruguay, that direction was down. 1954, World Cup in Switzerland. Uruguay were still very good. They reached the semi-finals, which is impressive. But they lost 4-2 to Hungary, the magical Magyars, one of the greatest teams in history. Then lost the 3rd place match to Austria. 4th place, still good but not champions. The aura of invincibility was starting to fade. 1958 didn't qualify. 1962 in Chile made the quarter-finals but lost to Yugoslavia. 1966 in England, quarter-finals again, lost to West Germany. 1970 in Mexico. Same thing, quarter-finals, lost to Brazil. So from 1962 to 1970, Uruguay made 3 straight World Cups and lost in the quarters every time. They were still competitive, still decent, but they weren't world beaters anymore. The days of dominating and winning World Cups felt like they were from a different era. Then 1974 happened. Uruguay, the 2-time World Cup champions, failed to qualify. For the first time in their history, they stayed home while the World Cup happened without them. That was a shock to the system. The realisation that Uruguay weren't automatically elite anymore. And it got worse. Much worse. The next 3 decades were brutal for Uruguayan football. They became mediocre. They became forgotten. Those 2 stars on their jersey started to feel like ancient history that nobody remembered. 1978 qualified for Argentina but went out in the groups. 1982 didn't qualify. 1986 made it to Mexico and reached the round of 16 but lost 1-0 to Argentina, who went on to win with Maradona. Respectable, but nothing special. 1990 in Italy, same story. Round of 16, lost 2-0 to the hosts. Uruguay were now just another team making up the numbers. The 2-time world champions were now just happy to be there. Then came the really dark period. 1994 failed to qualify. France 1998 failed to qualify. 2002 in Korea and Japan, they qualified but went out in the groups. 2006 in Germany, failed to qualify again. Let that sink in for a moment. Uruguay failed to qualify for 3 World Cups, 1994, 1998 and 2006. 3 tournaments where the 2-time world champions, the nation with 2 stars on their jersey, stayed home. For a country with Uruguay's history, this was absolutely humiliating. The glory days of the 1920s through 1950s weren't just distant, they felt like they'd happened to a completely different country. Younger Uruguayan fans, growing up in the 1990s and 2000s, had never seen their country be relevant on the world stage. They had to listen to their grandparents talk about Obdulio Varela and the Maracanazo like it was mythology. By the mid-2000s, Uruguayan football was in complete crisis. The national team was a mess. The domestic league was weak. The best Uruguayan players were leaving for Europe and Argentina as quickly as possible. And when they put on the national team jersey, they couldn't win. It looked like Uruguay would never be a major force in world football again. Those 2 stars on the jersey were just reminders of ancient history. But then, slowly, things started to change. A new generation of Uruguayan players started emerging in Europe's top leagues. And they weren't just making up the numbers, they were becoming stars. Diego Forlan at Villarreal, and then Atletico Madrid, scoring goals and winning the European Golden Shoe. Luis Suarez tearing up the Dutch league with Ajax, then moving to Liverpool and becoming one of the best strikers in the world. Edinson Cavani scoring for fun at Napoli. Diego Lugano leading defences in Brazil and Turkey. Suddenly, Uruguay had world-class players again. And crucially, they had the right manager, Oscar Tabarez, known as El Maestro, the teacher. He'd coached Uruguay before in the 1990s and they brought him back in 2006. And Tabarez completely rebuilt Uruguayan football from the ground up. Youth development systems, tactical discipline, creating a warrior mentality, bringing back that Garra Charrua spirit. The belief that Uruguay could compete with anyone. By the time 2010 World Cup qualifying came around, Uruguay had transformed. They qualified comfortably for South Africa, 2010, and they arrived with genuine belief. This wasn't Uruguay just happy to be there. This was Uruguay coming to compete. Group stage, and Uruguay were placed with France, Mexico, and host South Africa in Group A, and Uruguay topped the group. Drew 0-0 with France in a tight defensive match. Destroyed South Africa, 3-0 with goals from Forlan and 2 from Suarez. Drew 1-1 with Mexico. First place, clean sheets in 2 of 3 matches. The defense was absolutely rock solid. Uruguay were into the round of 16. They drew South Korea in the knockout round, and Uruguay took care of business. Luis Suarez scored both goals in a 2-1 victory. Uruguay were into the quarter-finals. The quarter-finals! For the first time since 1970. 40 years they'd been trying to get back to this stage, and now they were here. The quarter-final draw gave them Ghana. And this match right here, would become one of the most controversial matches in World Cup history. The match was tight, tense, physical. Both teams having chances but neither able to score. 90 minutes ended 1-1 after Forlan and Muntari had traded goals. Extra time. The match was going to be decided in the next 30 minutes. Whoever scored next was probably going to the semi-finals. Extra time was desperate. Both teams exhausted but pushing. And then, in the 120th minute, literally the last minute of extra time before penalties, Ghana got a free kick. They sent everyone forward. The ball came into the box, bounced around, and a Ghanaian player, Dominic Adaya, headed it toward the goal. The goalkeeper was beaten. The ball was heading in. Uruguay's defenders were out of position. Ghana were about to score and reach the semi-finals. They were going to become the first African team ever to reach a World Cup semi-final. The ball was literally inches from crossing the line. And then Luis Suarez, standing on the goal line because the goalkeeper wasn't there, stuck both his hands up and punched the ball away. Blatant handball, deliberately stopping a goal with his hands. The referee immediately showed a red card. Penalty to Ghana. Suarez walked off crying, knowing he'd missed the semi-final if Uruguay won, but also knowing he'd done what he had to do to give his team a chance. Asamoah Gyan stepped up to take the penalty. If he scored, Ghana won. They'd reached the semi-finals. Suarez would be the villain. Africa would have its first World Cup semi-finalist. Gyan placed the ball. The pressure was absolutely immense. He ran up and struck it well, but it hit the crossbar, bounced over, missed. The penalty was missed. The match went to a penalty shootout. Ghana's players were devastated. They'd been one successful penalty away from history. Now they had to take more penalties after missing the most important one, and Uruguay won the shootout 4-2. They were through to the semi-finals. Luis Suarez ran onto the field celebrating. Ghana and all of Africa were absolutely furious. Suarez had cheated. He'd deliberately handballed to stop a certain goal, but technically he'd been punished. Red card, penalty given. Ghana just didn't convert. By the rules, Uruguay had won, but morally, it felt wrong. The debate raged. Was Suarez a villain, or was he just doing whatever it took to help his team? Ghana felt robbed of their historic moment. Uruguay didn't care about the controversy. They were in the semi-finals of a World Cup for the first time in 40 years. They were 3 games from winning their 3rd World Cup. But the semi-final would be without Suarez suspended from the red card, and that made all the difference. The Netherlands in the semi-finals. Without Suarez's movement and goal-scoring threat, Uruguay struggled. They fought hard. Diego Forlán scored twice and was absolutely magnificent, but the Dutch were just too strong. 3-2 to the Netherlands. Uruguay were out of the World Cup. So close to the final. So close to a potential 3rd star, but there was still the 3rd place match against Germany. And Uruguay showed their character. Beat Germany 3-2, finished 4th in the world, and Diego Forlán won the Golden Ball as the tournament's best player. After decades of mediocrity, after missing World Cups, after being forgotten, Uruguay had announced to the world, "We're back. The Garra Charrua is real. The warrior spirit lives." Uruguay were once again a force in world football. 4 years later, Brazil, 2014. The golden generation was still going strong. Suarez and Cavani were now both playing at the absolute highest level. Suarez had been incredible at Liverpool. Cavani was scoring constantly at PSG. Uruguay qualified with confidence. Group stage started rough. Lost 3-1 to Costa Rica in a shock result. Not a great start. But then they faced England, and Luis Suarez put on a masterclass. Scored both goals in a 2-1 win. Uruguay were back in it. Final group match against Italy. Won 1-0 with a Diego Godin header. Advanced to the round of 16 in 2nd place behind Costa Rica. The tournament was alive. But then disaster struck. In that Italy match, Suarez had bitten Italian defender Giorgio Chiellini on the shoulder. Yes, bitten him, like a vampire. The replays were clear. Suarez's teeth marks were visible on Chiellini's shoulder. And this wasn't Suarez's first biting incident. He'd bitten an opponent while at Ajax. He'd bitten another opponent while at Liverpool. This was his 3rd time biting someone on a football pitch. FIFA came down hard. 9-match ban, 4 months banned from all football activity. He had to leave the World Cup immediately. Couldn't even attend Uruguay's matches. The controversy was massive. Luis Suarez, Uruguay's best player, was gone. The round of 16 without Suarez was tough. Colombia with James Rodriguez in incredible form. And without Suarez's threat, Uruguay couldn't create enough. Lost 2-0. James scored both goals and essentially ended Uruguay's tournament. They were out. A World Cup that had shown promise ended in disappointment and embarrassment because their star player couldn't control himself. 4 years later, Russia 2018. The golden generation was older now, but they were still together. Suarez and Cavani, in their early 30s, still world-class. New talent like Rodrigo Bentancur was emerging. Uruguay qualified comfortably. And in Russia, Uruguay were absolutely brilliant in the group stage. Group A with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and host Russia. Uruguay beat Egypt 1-0 with a late José Giménez header. Beat Saudi Arabia 1-0 with Suarez scoring. Then beat Russia 3-0 to top the group. 3 wins, 0 goals conceded in the group stage. The defence of Diego Godin and José Giménez was absolutely impenetrable. Uruguay were looking like serious contenders. Round of 16 they drew Portugal and Cristiano Ronaldo. And Edinson Cavani put on one of the greatest individual performances in knockout World Cup history, scored both goals in a 2-1 win. His second goal was an absolutely gorgeous chip. Pure class. Uruguay had eliminated Ronaldo and Portugal. They were in the quarter-finals again. But Cavani had injured himself scoring that second goal. He couldn't continue the match and was a doubt for the quarter-final. The celebrations were muted because everyone knew how important he was. Quarter-finals against France, and Cavani was too injured to start. Uruguay tried to cope without him. The defence was still brilliant, keeping it goalless for much of the match. But without Cavani's movement and goals, they couldn't create enough going forward. France eventually broke through in the second half. 2-0. Uruguay were out. Still a quarter-final, still a good tournament. But you couldn't help but wonder what might have been if Cavani had been fit. Qatar 2022 rolled around. And this time it felt different. Suarez and Cavani were both in their mid-30s now. This was clearly the end of an era. Darwin Núñez was the new striker hope. Federico Valverde was bossing midfields for Real Madrid. But it felt like a transition tournament. Group stage, drew 0-0 with South Korea. Lost 2-0 to Portugal. Then beat Ghana 2-0 in a match that had extra meaning after the 2010 controversy. But in the other match happening simultaneously, South Korea beat Portugal 2-1 in a shock result. Both Uruguay and South Korea finished with 4 points, but South Korea had a better goal difference. Uruguay were eliminated on goal difference. The Uruguay players were furious after the match. Luis Suarez was crying. Cavani confronted the VAR officials. They felt hard done by, felt unlucky. But the reality was they'd been eliminated in the group stage. The golden generation's era had ended not with glory, but with frustration and tears. So where does that leave Uruguay now? What's their World Cup legacy? 2 World Cup stars, 2 titles. 1930 at home against Argentina in the first ever World Cup. 1950 at Maracanã in Brazil in the greatest upset in football history. Only 8 nations have ever won a World Cup, and Uruguay is one of them, despite having just 3.5 million people. To put that in perspective, Croatia has more people than Uruguay, and they've never won. Netherlands has 5 times more people, and never won. Uruguay, with their tiny population, has 2 stars. It's genuinely incredible. The 1920s through 1950s were Uruguay's golden era. 2 Olympic golds, 2 World Cups, absolute dominance. That generation established Uruguay's legacy forever. Those players, Obdulio Varela, Alcides Gigia, Oscar Miguez, they're legends not just in Uruguay, but in world football. Then came the decline. The 1960s through 2000s were brutal. Decades of mediocrity, missed tournaments, being forgotten by the football world. The glory days felt like ancient history. But then the 2010s resurgence. Forlan, Suarez, Cavani. That generation brought Uruguay back to relevance. 4th place in 2010, quarter-finals in 2018. They reminded the world that Uruguay, tiny Uruguay, can compete with anyone. And it's not just about talent, it's about mentality. Garra Charrua, warrior spirit. That willingness to do absolutely whatever it takes to win. Suarez's handball against Ghana in 2010 is the perfect example. Controversial. Absolutely. Effective. He gave his team a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Uruguay doesn't have the talent pool of Brazil or Argentina. They don't have the population of European giants. But they have that fighting spirit that makes them incredibly dangerous. Uruguay is the team nobody wants to draw in a World Cup. They're organised, they're physical, they're tactically disciplined, and they never, ever give up. They're the ultimate dark horse. You think you've beaten them and then Suarez or Cavani scores from nowhere. You think they're dead and then they come back. That's Uruguay. 2026 is coming to North America. Uruguay will be there. But they're in transition now. Suarez retired from international football after Qatar. Cavani is done. The golden generation is over. Darwin Núñez at Liverpool. Federico Valverde at Real Madrid. Rodrigo Bentancur at Tottenham. These are the new leaders. Talented players but young, still learning.